So art, visual art, music, literature, philosophy, theology, sciences, all of these grew up at the same time in different places around Europe at various different stages. And so separating one from the other in these specialisms, which is what we have now, the way that we study things in universities particularly, it's kind of divorcing one thing from another and kind of leaches out some of the meaning that we can actually enrich more our studies and our understanding of culture and of artistic patronage if we try and connect them. And so that's what I was trying to do when I was presenting this course to the musicians. So it's a useful way to launch into this discussion. So I'm going to look at that now, and as I said, it's only a couple of minutes. And then we will go back and look at each image in turn, and I'll say a little bit about some of the contexts in which these artworks were made. At that point, which is a building that perhaps recognizable to many of you, which is the cathedral in Florence, the Duomo, and the dome of it made by Brunelleschi in the early 15th century. We come really to the end of what is generally considered to be the medieval period in art and the beginning of the Renaissance, Florence in the 15th century being essentially quite justifiably called the cradle of the Italian Renaissance. And so that span that we've covered in those images is really quite an extraordinary span in only 350, 400 years. So it's a kind of, in a sense it's a turning back, because we're going to go back and look now, but the first of those images was the Romanesque cathedral at Hildesheim in Germany, St. Michael, or Abbey Church. And that is in the Romanesque style. Romanesque meaning like Roman, and therefore there is very strong elements of classical architecture within that. So inasmuch as people often characterize in quite blunt terms the division between medieval and Renaissance, to say that medieval was a certain sort of way and it wasn't looking back to the classical past, there were always elements of the classical past throughout the whole of this period, and it sort of is something that cannot be avoided, cannot be taken and put to one side. But here you can certainly see a swing through various different stages until we get to a moment in which Brunelleschi, much influenced by Alberti, who was working as a philosopher and mathematician in Florence, his rediscovery of the writings of Vitruvius on art and architecture, and working out a way both technically and conceptually of creating this extraordinary object, a dome, the largest dome that has been built since classical times. So that's going to take us back to the beginning of the film and just have a look at the images in turn. Okay, so the names that appear on the screen are the names that you have on your handout there. So St. Berwald, the abbot of Hildesheim, is generally considered to be the person who initiated the building program that created this magnificent abbey church. A very important centre of Christianity in Germany at the time. A very large and eventually very wealthy Benedictine monastery. And when this image, this church, gives me an opportunity to talk about the importance of the spread of the Benedictine monasteries across Europe in what are generally known as the Dark Ages and then beyond, creating centres of scholarship, centres in which art, not only architecture in the building of the abbey churches, but particularly art in the creation of manuscripts and copying of books and so on. These were centres in which these things were able to flourish because of the large number of people that were attracted to work in the monasteries, both those who took orders and became monks, but those who were associated as lay brothers, those who were associated in other ways, because essentially these monasteries also, as is well known, were centres for social care, for hospitals, for educating the young, and also for farming and civilising, as it were, the countryside after the depredations of the period, which I'm just going to handily call the Dark Ages, but let's say after the fall of the Roman Empire and sort of chaos and instability on a social and political level was the dominating feature of life in Europe. So the monastery is enormously important. And so when we look at this structure, we can see one thing that's very, very clear about it is the solidity of this building. The fact that the walls are very, very strong, very thick, very heavy, that the arches are rounded, that it's built in a sense like a fortress. And this is, not all Romanesque architecture is of this type. We have some Romanesque architecture here in this country, particularly Durham Cathedral is something that comes to mind. Very strong, very heavy stone, because it's a technical issue, as well as married with what was an awareness at the time of the destiny of these buildings, and that there was something to do with the stability that was represented by this strength as well, as perhaps a technical issue about having not yet, as it were, developed the knowledge about how to refine things and to open large window spaces. That's what we're going to see as techniques developed. Because I think there's always something to be said about the relationship between peace and art. And where there is peace, where there is not so much discord in society, where there is a chance for trade and for agriculture to develop, then this extended sort of, as it were, space for society to to expand into different areas gives a possibility for art to develop. And so when we talk of patronage, which is a word that I've used already, and Matthew's going to also be talking about patronage in terms of music, patronage there has to be somebody who buys art, who buys music, in the sense of asking somebody, come and make this for me, and I will pay you for this service. And so the monasteries, everybody contributed towards the creation of buildings and works of art and so forth, sculptures, to decorate them. But of course, these things were made by people, and those people had to be paid. And so there's a kind of nexus in which, you know, the greater the stability and the increased wealth of not only the monasteries as individual places, but the cities, then courts, and then the papacy, and so forth. The greater wealth, the greater leisure, and the greater security enhance the possibilities for the making of art. Okay, let's move to the next. That's a kind of view that most beautifully shows the effect of this particular part of the church. This is the Church of Saint-Denis, the Cathedral of Saint-Denis in Paris, well, outside Paris, to the north of Paris, which is the place where Saint-Denis, Saint Denis, the patron of Paris, is buried, and where the kings of France were buried. And consequently, its status as a royal chapel, obviously originally a monastic foundation also, made it a place that was of considerable importance in terms of theology, in terms of the wealth that was gathered around it, because obviously it was a shrine to a martyr, and therefore attracted a lot of people to it. So consequently, when it came to the time of Abbot Suger, who is credited with the creation of this part of the church, it was a famous church already, and his concern with creating something new and something extraordinary for this special part of the church was manifested in his concern for the rearrangement of what's called, in French, the chevet, the head, as it were, the chapels around the top end of the church, around the east end of the church, behind the high altar. So he, and this is written down in texts that he produced in relation to the rebuilding of the church, was that he made these chapels that radiated round to be separated by 12 columns, and the 12 columns, of which you see some here, representing the 12 apostles. And so there's a very strong connection in everything that he was considering in this work between the philosophical and theological construct behind it and the technique and the actual building in itself. So this wonderful opening of the wall surface and inserting of glass, stained glass windows, to give light to the head. Again, this is something that's written about by him in his account of the rebuilding, is that this is again representative of the Godhead, representative of the Logos, the light of Christ, the truth of the Word. And Suger was very influenced by Neoplatonic philosophy at the time, so it's something that was working in, the philosophy working into and feeding into what was then becoming possible in a technical sense for masons and architects to put together. So it's a kind of perfect moment, really, in which when we look at this, and this is where we come up with the, against the term Gothic, which is a term that was attributed to this period of architecture much later in history, but is a handy term, it's a useful term to have, to use when we talk about this, particularly the style of the pointed arch. So the pointed arch is, has a technical function. You remember those heavy walls in Hildesheim, and if you want to make openings in them, in order to carry the thrust of the roof and the walls down into the earth, a pointed opening is much more robust in terms of the construction of the building than an arch opening. So that is one reason why the pointed arch developed. Another reason was, of course, with increased trade and increased travel, there was contact with the East, and in Arabic architecture at the time, the pointed arch was something that was familiar. So nobody's quite sure where exactly it came from, but there was a certain moment when this arrived in Western Europe, and this pointed arch was embraced as technically satisfying, gave enormous possibilities for the opening up of the wall space for light, and fitted very much into the philosophical and theological moment that the church was going through. And so here we have a patron who was enlightened in terms of his own personal learning, a very learned man, a philosopher in his own right, who was able to call on artists, architects, designers of glass and so forth, and put all of this together thanks to the importance of this church as a pilgrimage site, as a reliquary for the head of Saint-Denis, which is what is kept there. And obviously, deliberately, I'm not talking about the music here because Matthew's going to do that, but just to mention that contemporaneous with the building of this, the rebuilding of Saint-Denis, is the music of Hildegard, of which Matthew's going to speak more. And in terms of what we were mentioning earlier on monasteries and the wealth and importance of the monasteries, Hildegard was an abbess of a monastery of nuns in Germany, and she herself, rather like Suger at Saint-Denis, was an enormously cultured and educated individual, very powerful both in administrative and managerial terms, running this enormous abbey, and writing poetry, writing philosophical and theological texts. She was a visual artist, and so, in a sense, created an extraordinary sort of centre of culture around her particular monastery also. Okay, we'll move on. Okay, so here we're staying in France. We're staying in the Île-de-France region, which is famous for the magnificent and very large and increasingly large, even to the extent of being impossibly large, so they fell down quite quickly, such as at Beauvais, Gothic cathedrals. And they were built taller and taller, and the walls were thinner and thinner, and the glass got more and more expansive. And this was, in a sense, the sort of rapid rise of technical skill, sometimes slightly exaggerated. However, here we have in around 1200, 1180, we have Notre Dame de Paris, the main church of Paris, the cathedral of Paris, the home of the Bishop of Paris. And here we have something that differs from the monasteries that we've been mentioning earlier, such as, well, Hildegard's and the one in Germany, because those, and Saint-Denis, because they were separate from the city. So by this time, in the 12th century, certain cities, and Paris was one of them, were growing in power and influence, and as centres of trade, administrative centres, and obviously governmental centres, state centres. They attracted scholars, they attracted tradesmen, businessmen. It was a place that people came and people felt safer in the cities. Cities could grow and develop because there was no longer so much conflict between small city-states and small marauding bands of nobles with their soldiers and so forth. So, in a way, Paris was in a perfect moment for this great church to express the civic identity of the city. And this part of the church, again, we're looking at exactly the same part, the chapels and around the east end of the church, where behind the high altar. And here we're looking at the exterior, and these, of course, famous flying buttresses that characterize Gothic architecture, in order to have that very, very thin skin of stone pierced by all of those window spaces to flood the interior with light and with colour, because obviously the painted glass, the stained glass is actually a misnomer because the glass is painted, not stained. In order for that to survive and not to fall down, it had to be supported from the outside. And so the thrust that came down through the roof and the walls otherwise would push outwards, and so those flying buttresses holding on one on top of the other and keeping the whole structure together. And in a sense also it's that beautiful conjunction between form and function, because this creates a very large space for the visiting pilgrims, the visiting faithful who would come to the church, and it also represents in itself as a unity. It represents something very symbolic, and this is something that people responded to straight away. It's very famous, and when we go to Paris now, we can look at it on the island, and it looks like a ship, looks like an upturned ship. So in a sense, it represents the Church of Christ. It has all of that symbolism, which is so important, as we saw at Saint-Denis, goes on to be important throughout the medieval period. I mean, obviously later as well, but once we're into the Renaissance, people are looking much more at scientific evidence, at mathematics, actually driving a certain study of reality, and the idea of symbolism, particularly of number symbolism, diminishes. However, in medieval times it was enormously important. Okay, now we're going to look at something that's a little different. Okay, so here we're with our first painting that I'm showing at any rate. And this isn't actually one image. Probably those of you who've heard of Les Trébucheurs will understand that it is a series of paintings. Each one of these images is a page from a book of prayers, a book of hours. The Book of Hours was actually the commonest book that was owned by people throughout medieval Europe. It was the hours of prayer that mimicked the hours that the monks would pray in the monasteries, but this is a book that non-monks, secular people would be able to have. Obviously wealthy people would have a Book of Hours, and praying to Virgin Mary in specific forms at specific times of the day. And this particular book, Les Trébucheurs, which obviously connotes the value of this very particular volume, which was commissioned by the Duke of Burgundy. And the Duke of Burgundy was perhaps even more powerful than the French king at certain times at this period, and he was also extremely rich and owned large areas of land, both in Burgundy but also up in the north, in what is now Belgium and the Netherlands. So the Dukes of Burgundy were patrons of the arts and were able to commission works of art of such exquisite perfection as these miniatures. When I say miniatures, they're actually quite large. The book itself is quite a large, very, very special book in which the prayers are on one side and the text are faced by these images. Now there's 12 of them in this sort of montage of images, and that's because they're representing the months of the year. And as you can see, the zodiac and the times of the day across the top are represented again in the scenes in the paintings, where labours of the seasons in terms of the agriculture, what people would be doing at different times of the year, are represented in each of these paintings. So each one of these pictures is a rather fascinating microcosm of high medieval life, because we have obviously the theological function of the book. So each hour would be represented by one of these pictures, but the zodiac shows the concern for astronomy, which was an enormously important study throughout the medieval period. Then the labours of the monks that are depicted show a concern with humans and what they were doing. This isn't just about theology and philosophy. It's not just about abstract things and wondering about what's going on in the heavens, but it's also about people. And so these depictions are quite fascinating images of peasants at work in the fields. Also the lords and ladies over on the right and on the left going out and enjoying the countryside with hunting and so forth. Again, a sign that the increasing wealth of society at this period was enabling leisure to develop. And the music that goes with this is a secular song. So the pieces of music, of course, that we've been hearing so far have all been related to the liturgy in some way or another, either to the Mass or motets or other pieces of music that are related to the Catholic faith. However, this particular piece of music, as is the images in these paintings, is the beginning of a big expression of secular society. There was always, those two things were hand in hand, but it's not often in the early period that secular song was notated, was written down, just as it wasn't so often that images of people doing things that weren't related to the stories from the Bible, the lives of the saints, the life of the Virgin, were not often depicted in visual art. So then we have to think about the commissioner, the person who was paying for this. You know, the Dukes of Burgundy were very worldly men and women. They had a very fabulous court. It was all about diplomacy, it was about trade. Who knows about their personal piety? Some of them were notoriously, let's say, possibly scandalous in their lives, but that's not really the concern. The concern is more on the issue of how they chose to commission their works of art. And so we see a rise in secular music and a rise in the enjoyment of secular art at this time. This image is a panel from the magnificent wooden altarpiece painted by the Van Eyck brothers for a chapel in the church of St. Bavon in Ghent. Ghent was now in Belgium, was in the area that was under the tutelage at some parts of time of the Dukes of Burgundy. So part of that kingdom, part of that very wealthy society. And the confraternity who commissioned this extraordinary object, which if you haven't seen it and you have an opportunity, it's probably the greatest thing that you can see close to London in terms of medieval painting, is really an extraordinary object, very, very large, in a tiny chapel where they've now moved it outside of the chapel. And this is the central panel which shows the Adoration of the Lamb, which is the central theme of the altarpiece. And it is also made up of many panels, each one showing different aspects of the Catholic faith, and the centerpiece being the Eucharist and so forth. So the picture itself has an enormous range of meaning in relation to its role as an altarpiece, as a devotional object, as an incitement to devotion amongst the faithful. It also has a lot to tell us about technique, because it's painted in oils on panel. So it's one of the first oil paintings. It used to be said that Jan van Eyck and his brother Hubert were those who invented oil painting. Well, obviously you can't say invented oil painting like you can't say invented the pointed arch in Gothic time. But certainly this is one of the most significant works of art that was first painted with oils. And so there was obviously some connection there between different techniques that travelling artists were sharing amongst themselves. So the idea of using the oil as a medium, which made things more luminous, made them able to be altered for longer, whereas previous tempera and fresco, when you're painting on wall, these things that dry very quickly, and it becomes difficult then to make a change. With oil painting, obviously, you know, it stays malleable, it stays wet for longer, so you get a much more luminous effect with your colour, but you also makes the technique more flexible for the artist. So this is an extraordinary moment in a way, in an artistic sense, because this incredible image, so complex that you know it has a huge bibliography, masses of books have been written about it, and there's a lot to say. But I'll just restrict myself to say the patronage context is very important. Again, the huge wealth of the Netherlands at the time, particularly in relation to England and the trade in wool. The composer of this piece of music was an Englishman who came to the Netherlands and made a great career in northern France and in the Netherlands, because this is where a lot of money was to be made. Their courts there were commissioning and paying for artists to join as court artists, and this was probably one of the richest places for art to flourish at the time. So, you know, what we know in the history of art is early Netherlandish painting. The reason it is so rich and it is so splendid is because of the focus and how much money there was at that time in that area. And a lot of it was in relation to the trade in wool from the British Isles through the Netherlands and then eventually down to Italy, particularly to Florence, which is again why Florence became so rich at a certain time. And so the last of the images that I'm going to show is, in fact, in Florence. Okay, so the Cathedral of Florence, the Duomo, had been building for a long time, for 100 years or more. But the solution for the dome was one that puzzled the Signoria, the governing body of the city who were involved in the planning of it, because nobody knew what form it was going to take. And obviously there were competitions involved, there was a great flowering, let's say, bringing together of intellectual and technical genius in Florence at the time. And there were many people who had lots of ideas about the most suitable. And when Brunelleschi started to do his design and he started to build this dome, nobody quite believed that it was going to be possible. And apparently if you know Florence, the streets are very narrow that lead up to the Duomo, and you get glimpses of it down these narrow streets. Well, while the dome was being constructed, he made sure that it was all covered up with something, so that it was going to be a revelation. It really did sort of burst onto the scene in 1436 as a completely extraordinary and new object that could be only seen in one way, which was to present the civic identity of Florence to the world, primarily to Italy obviously, but the fame of this building would spread all over Europe, as being powerful, wealthy, whose piety and devotion was beyond reproach. It was a sort of a summation, a statement of civic identity, and the dome's connection with this engineering feat of covering an interior space without any supporting span, and the construction techniques that were used in it all go back to the rediscovery of texts that the ancient Romans had left for us, as it were, to benefit from, and those scholars and humanists in the period of the early 15th century in Florence were able to take those and to use them and help them put together this extraordinary structure. And so when Brunelleschi unveiled the dome, And when the Pope came, who was living in Florence at the time, actually, because things weren't too peaceful in Rome for the papacy, he was living in Florence, and the dome was dedicated for the people of Florence. Many things were written, many accounts were written about it, and it was to do with the idea that all the people of Florence could be sheltered under the dome. So again, we have this idea of the symbolism of the building of the church as a place to contain, to hold all the people of God. And that dome was famous at its very moment of its creation as being something of which there was no possible parallel. So you can see that we're moving away from the slightly anonymous architects and sculptors and other technicians who worked on the great cathedrals in France, most of whom were travelling from one place to another, and we don't really know many of their names, we don't know anything about them, to a moment in which the fame of the artist, his personal commitment to training and to education, what he wrote about it and what people wrote about him, this changed the whole picture. And this is what we call Renaissance humanism, and then this is what we call the beginning of a new approach in art, architecture, learning, and also in all the other aspects of culture, which I've tried to touch on a little bit. So I'm going to stop there, and Matthew is going to take over.
So I'm going to talk about almost all of those composers, and a few more. And I'm going to try and link them all specifically to the patronage structures in which those pieces were either commissioned or just written or appreciated. And through doing that, I'm going to try and explain how the patronage system was either shared or different for the different arts, but that they all shared I'm going to take that off in a sec. But they all shared a context and situation, and through that try and present a case for, or secondarily present a case for liberal art study, sort of on the slide. I want to start with Hildegard von Bingen. Hildegard, as we were talking about, is an incredibly famous individual in her time, and very rarely her music was all published in a collected work in her lifetime, which she herself did editions of. The first full collected version was published in 1150, and it's called Symphonia, and she obviously had a lot to do with its actual binding, the order in which it was presented, a volume which you could say that is my musical output. She was committed at a very young age to a female hermit called Jutta, and she grew up on her own in this cell, saying all the hours on her own. And you can certainly hear in her music and her composition the what sitting on your own can do to your sensibility, because they're incredibly personal. The scope of the range in some of these pieces is staggering, and they're the kind of pieces which you wouldn't write for someone else to sing. They're the kind of pieces which you would write for yourself to sing, knowing what your own limits are. And the breath control is so personally tailored, and interestingly, they're written in most of the things she wrote were sequences and hymns. Sequences, obviously, that it's poetry, but it's not rhyme. There's no a scheme. So none of the music copies itself either. From verse to verse, the music changes. So there's an incredible sense of development of thought and emotion from each beginning of each sequence to the end. And we're going to hear one of those in a couple of days' time in here, the 6th of August, in here. And the one we're going to hear is O Euchari, which is a sequence to Saint Eucharius, I think is how you actually say it, which was commissioned by local sects or local cult who were trying to petition for the canonization of this local holy man. And that's one of the ways in which we can look at Hildegard in a patronage context, which is that she created her own music and her own works. She wasn't working for anyone, she was creating them for the renown of her abbey. So she would write pieces for groups in the understanding that then it would help people to know what she was trying to do here, create a new kind of mystical living in a Benedictine construct. So I think that's interesting. Think about it. She's taking commissions, she's accepting the patronage of others, but not for money. She's doing it because she genuinely thinks it's the way to go for her community. I think it's also interesting that an intrinsic part of her output as a spiritual mystic was the composition of music. So she's writing philosophy and theology, and she's also composing music, and that's not seen as odd at all. That's very much along the same lines as what you'd expect. And I think that in the same way that a philosopher, an intellectual of the periods, people like Boethius and going backwards, would always write a bit about music in their discussion of philosophy, that in her discourse as a spiritual mystic, she would also compose. I think there's a parallel to be drawn there. In many ways, music, as part of the quadrivium, is seen as preparatory for the study of the higher sciences, the philosophy, medicine, and theology. A sensibility for music was proof of an ordered mind. So Hildegard's compositions and her ability to work with melody and harmony is proof of people that she actually does know what she's talking about in the grand scheme. I thought that was worth mentioning. Next we're going to talk about Bernard de Ventadorn, who you might recognise the name. No. Bernard de Ventadorn was one of the first very famous troubadours from Provence, and he sort of characterised and invented, as it were, what a troubadour does. So before that, there are people that travel around, they sing at courts, or actually more like towns at this point, villages. But Bernard de Ventadorn is instrumental in the raising up of this practice into what we call the courtly love tradition. I've got everyone's dates written down here. So Bernard de Ventadorn, we reckon about 1130 to 1200. And Bernard de Ventadorn was one of these travelling lesser or higher nobles. It wasn't really distinct. Anyone could be a troubadour as long as you were some form of noble. And they really are, and Bernard is a very good example of this, an incarnation of their art form. So Ventadorn is going around courts, and he's singing of men going around courts professing love for women. And he himself is doing that whilst he's doing that, he's singing about it. And it's a really lovely sort of idea where he's self-maintaining his own sort of job as he's going. I thought this was worth mentioning because it's very distinct from most of the other patronage ideas that we're going to come across later, in that Bernard de Ventadorn is almost self-employed, but he's going to different courts, and he throws himself on the beneficence of the court, of the duke or count or the earl or king. He's going, here's my song, can I stay here for a few months? That really is what it is on basic level. Bernard's a little bit more famous, so he's a little bit less travelled, because when he got somewhere, they didn't want to let him go. So his story is quite interesting. He wasn't as highborn as a lot of others, but he was trained by the Viscount of Ventadorn, who himself had a penchant for writing these sort of troubadour songs. He went to Montluçon, then Toulouse, which was a centre for troubadours, and then he followed Ellen of Aquitaine to England and the Plantagenet court. Later he returned to Toulouse and worked for Raymond V, the Count of Toulouse, and went to the Dordogne, and then finally he entered the monastery in Dordogne. Eleanor of Aquitaine is a really good example of incredibly wealthy women who were the key patrons of this kind of courtly love lyric tradition. In fact, Eleanor, so the sort of legend goes, was sort of the real-life Guinevere of Arthurian legend, in that she was a little bit apparently promiscuous, and she sort of patronised all of this arts going on. It was much more her than anyone she married or was hanging out with. So yeah, she's an interesting example of lots of women, sometimes married, sometimes widowed, so they have all this money, and what better to do with it than be patron to a lot of musicians and have an enormous court set of music. I'm going to move on now to something completely different, which you have on your slips. Leonard and Peritan, Leonard you have there, both worked at Notre Dame in slightly different job titles. I think it is important here to understand the preeminence of Paris as a cultural and intellectual centre. Between 1150 and 1250, this was the place to be, as we've heard, and it's certainly the case in music as well. And I think this is probably as good a time as any to discuss the structure of a cathedral chapter, because you do have to sort of understand where the money is coming from in a cathedral system at the time to pay for these musicians, in order to understand the place the musicians can occupy within the chapter, so it's a bit more simple. So we have a dean and chapter of canons, about 50, and under them we have the priest canons, then we have deacon canons and subdeacon canons. And then we go to the other churches inside the close of Notre Dame, and there then the next one run down would be the canons of St. Adrian, and then St. Denis and St. I've forgotten the other one, but they are let lower down on the run. And all of those people, they are the ones responsible for actually doing the singing in the cathedral, carrying out the services. The canons aren't really anywhere to be seen. They meet once a year, and just because you hold a canonry in Notre Dame doesn't mean you ever actually set foot in Notre Dame Cathedral or do any of the services or anything. It just simply means that you are beneficed with an amount of land allotted for one of the canons of Notre Dame Cathedral. If you were a singer in Notre Dame Cathedral, you would probably be a deacon. First and foremost, you'd be a choir boy. If you were a very good choir boy, you would be a spare. If you were a good spare, you would be one of the Sochikori, or the poor singers, and you wouldn't be beneficed, you wouldn't have a clerkship, as it's called, but you would be you'd be in some form of lesser orders in the choir. If you were quite good at that, then you might hope to proceed to be one of the acolytes, and then so on. You would eventually reach deacon, and a modestly good musician might hope to reach canon of St. Adrian by the end of his 50-year career in the cathedral. So you see that in order to patronise the music of Notre Dame, what you're actually doing is you're allowing singers to come up through the ordained circuit in order to then give them the money that they can earn, because there's no cash in any of these institutions, it's church institutions, it's all prebends which come on yearly, and every bit of money is promised to a different person the whole time. So that's going to become a problem a bit later, in a few centuries' time, in a few minutes' time. But for now, it seems to be working fine, and these musicians are getting promoted up the ladder, and when they reach a certain point, then they think, okay, that's all I'm really going to achieve here. So yeah, musicians within the benefit system taking money that priests should be having. So development of organum, I've got written here, or thought of the past. What was that music we were hearing? That was what we call organum, and I'm going to do a really quick explanation of what that is. It's when you take a piece of plain chant, and then you have another part moving above it, singing a specially written tune which sort of fits harmonically. So two melodies together so that it sounds nice. And I think this is a really early indicator of what's going to become incredibly important, and that is authority of the past. If you're trying to create something beautiful, the answer is not to make something completely new. That would be heinous. What you're actually meant to do is take something that someone else has created and embellish it, interpolate it in some way, to be something new enough and something that you've created. So in order to make something worthy of the divine liturgy, you have to prove that it has a foot in the past. You have to prove that someone else has done it before and that it was good, and that other people thought it was good. You can't turn up with something and expect it to go in the Mass. That's not okay. So that's what organum is. There's a very interesting book. It's called the Magnus Liber Organi. It's an incredibly important, huge volume of this organum stuff, which Leonan wrote. His dates are about 1152. People think the turn of the century didn't live too long. He was called a magister, so he was educated in Paris, in Paris University, then entered straight into the system, worked his way up to be sort of one of the dudes in charge of organising the music. He wrote this enormous compilation of organum. I keep doing this, but that's because it is really this thick. It's about this big. And it's called the Magnus Liber Organi. And that is another example of someone creating their own compilation. But the difference here is that it's all anonymous. And we only know it's by him because other people have said that he wrote it. So there's no names in this. This is the Notre Dame book of organum. When these people got these jobs, they're not expected to be able to compose. But the fact that they can is very quickly taken by these institutions and put their stamp on. When Leonan got his job as a kid singing in the cathedral, they're not taking him because he can compose music, they're taking him because he can sing a bit. And the fact that then he turns out to be an incredible composer is at this point purely luck. So all these places with amazing music at this point, they're not hiring in these composers. Composing is happening as a secondary job, or a lucky coincidence of what it is your job is in the first place. The dissemination of this book, Magnus Liber Organi, was incredible. It reached Florence and loads of places in Germany, and there are 3 existing surviving full copies of it. And it was only used on special occasions, feast days, saints' days. You didn't just use organum all the time. Staple fare is still plain chant, but we'll use this organum polyphony on special occasions. So musicians of the benefit system and organum. Not sure. Next, we have Philip de Vitry, who was slightly different to the other two. They're Pertin and Leonan, they're good at what they do, but they're not nobles. They reach canon status, but they're not. They're nothing to do with court life. It refers specifically to a new technology of music writing, whereby the composer can transmit the rhythm of what you are meant to be singing or playing. If you can't believe this, no one knows what the rhythm is of any music written before Philip de Vitry writes music down, and that starts at about 1300. So that's quite important, that now we know the rhythm of music from little shapes, not just, they don't look the same now, they're not just grouped, specific shapes and signs for the length of notes. He creates a whole series of what we would call time signatures, or they would call mensuration correlation patterns. I prefer time signatures, but and that is a brand new technology. It's really interesting because it allows you to write much more complex rhythms and complex music at lines that go at the same time as each other. You now know how they're going to fit in together. A motet is a very interesting part of musical construction because it's not just a piece of choral music. It is a piece of 3 or 4 parts, the bottom part of which is actually called the tenor. From tenere to hold, it holds a piece of plain chant, and that'll go along happily. And in an Ars Nova motet, the plain chant is separated into 5 or 6 note sections, and each section has the same rhythm. For example, it could be do 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 do. Then it'll go again. Different notes, same rhythm. And that rhythm will happen over and over again. And on top, you have these other 2 lines, and they sing in different languages, different texts completely. So you can't hear anything that's going on, but it sounds very nice. And they sing, one's often in Latin and one's in French, And the whole point of a motet is it's meant to be very cleverly giving you an extra hidden meaning as to what it's all about. So say the bottom is from the Feast of the Assumption, and then there's a Latin poem about Mary, and then there's a sort of French lyric on the top, very fast, so you almost can't hear it, talking about something a little bit more risque to do with virginity. And the whole thing has a hidden meaning, which you can think about yourself. Yeah, I wish I had an example, really, that's a bit of a shame. But yeah, that's Philip de Vitry and how he managed to work in the court and in the church and wrote these motets. Very important man. A really important thing about Philip de Vitry is that he wrote lots of admonitory songs. He was very keen to give advice and warning to the rulers that he worked with. And lots of his songs and his lyrics and motets are really quite finger-wagging to these people in charge, and they're telling them the way to behave as a king, the way to behave as a ruler. He's taking the high courtly love behavioural codes of the troubadours, and he's mixing them with the polyphony of the church to come up with a new genre. Well, let's skip on now to Guillaume de Machaut. Maybe we'll hear of one soon. The Guillaume de Machaut, he's in a similar situation. Both he and Vitry, by royal decree, were made full canons of the chapter in Notre Dame. No other singer or musician could attain that, but because they both worked in courts, they were given these proper canonries. Machaut worked in the court of King John I of Bohemia, who was also the Count of Luxembourg. He was firstly the almoner, court almoner, or almoner, and he was in charge of giving away gifts and charity. He had the king's, figuratively and literally, the king's purse. And it was at his discretion that he could give, and there's no difference between charity to a poor man on the street and a political gift of money to someone in the court. And it's his job to look out for the king's best interests and to pay people that will have those interests adhered to. The fact that he was court almoner had a lasting influence on his doctrine, personal doctrine of courtly love and behaviour. And it cemented in him the importance of giving and the centrality of largesse, posturing by giving, by being very generous. You can reinforce your own power, your own standing, by giving a man £100, I am his boss, even if it's a gift. You know, it's this is all what the court was about. The king was giving away money, not necessarily to be helpful, but just to remind people how much money he had. And so that everyone feels like then they have to give back. There was a whole economy of gift giving which people wrote enormous poems on. And in Machaut's case, it really changed his opinions about what it was to be a musician and a composer. Because Machaut decided that he would not give his pieces freely, and his poems, freely to the king. He would always wait to be asked. And in doing such, because he understood what gift-giving was about, maybe not how we see, but in this context, by adopting a more decorous standpoint of giving him his gifts, he put the person he was giving them to, he wasn't doing the posturing, he was actually being on the back foot himself, which made the king, in this case, make sure he always gave him more money. In response, I'm not doing a great job of explaining this, I'm going to try again. He redrew the lines of patronage from a free gift-giving economy to a mercantile commissioning system, because he wanted to give specific price tags and not just symbolic price tags to his work. This is an incredibly important shift in that he works for a patron, but he does want extra money for writing specific pieces. He's not just giving these pieces away. Here you are, my beneficent ruler, please give me some money next week. He's going, concretely, how much do I get for this? Which is quite cheeky, but he did quite well at it. And there's a good quote here. If I can find it. As Paris's gift secured Venus's status as the most beautiful, that was a lovely statue of Venus. As Paris's gift secured Venus's status as the most beautiful, and in turn she secured the shepherd the role as the quintessential lover, so the poet's gift of the transcribed complaint or lyric transforms the moaning and powerless prince into a recognised lover, who in turn will establish the poet as without peer. There's a slightly more understanding of what the jobs are in the court under Machaut. Now we're going to move on to Landini, Francesco Landini, in lieu of Gottschalk, who you saw alongside of the miniatures, because no one knows anything about Gottschalk, and it would be incredibly hard to say anything about him other than his name's Gottschalk. Francesco Landini was a secular musician in Florence, and so I just want to talk a little bit about Florentine society and his dates are 1335 to 1397. So into the middle and late 14th century now. Florence is different to other courts, other places. It is, at this point, the lesser city to Verona and Venice. It's an intensely communal and interactive and pluralistic place to live. Society was completely shaped by the tastes and attitudes of merchants and its artisans, who were strongly rooted in the public life of the city. Composers were drawn from the lower middle class. They were associated with churches and convents with a strong local orientation. So they're doing things for the people on the same layer as them. The high and low and the sacred and the secular divides, therefore, are much more blurred in Florence in the mid-14th century. And a good way to talk about that blurring is the lauda, singing of lauda, and the laudesi confraternities. These are groups of laymen who decided to establish companies or confraternities and would sing a monophonic, that's an unaccompanied song in the vernacular. In Italian, it was non-liturgical, but they were religious, and they decided they'd get together every week and they would sing these things for hours and hours, and that would be a sort of entertainment, a way to keep entertained. And throughout then, the middle of the 14th century, there's a slow mingling of the polyphonists' work and these lauda songs. These lauda were the medium through which the democratization of polyphonic performance occurred in the 14th century. So we have Johannes de Croceo speaking about polyphonic music, about motets at the end of the 13th century. He's saying only the very highest of the high people should hear these motets. They're really not for anyone else. They wouldn't understand them, it'd be wasted on. And now in Florence, there's a democratization of this music through these confraternities. It's a non-liturgical, vernacular, urban, non-courtly, monophonic song. And these laudesi confraternities are their establishment is linked to the establishment of mendicant orders and the convents. And it's those mendicant convents in Tuscany and Umbria from the late 13th century where these confraternities are being based, where they're coming from. So, large companies like the one I have here is a good example, Michael Company. It was actually the most stable professional musical establishment throughout the 14th and 15th centuries. So in a European capital, or a European very important city, actually the most stable and important patronage structure is a confraternity and no aristocrats in sight. They're financing it themselves, they're making it happen themselves. And they do it through mingling the high with the low, the sacred and the secular. And just to illustrate that point, by the middle of the 14th century, they're hiring, they're not just singing themselves, they start to hire professional singers, and by the end, they're actually hiring full-time directors of music by the 1370s. So you see the complete transformation that's happened in the secular music of Florence during the 14th century. Landini represents a new generation of Florentine Trecento composers, polyphonic composers, who in about 1370, when the political structure of the society of Florence changes and starts to allow for a more traditional aristocratic patronage system to happen, we have a new influx of pure polyphony in Florence, 1370s, 80s and 90s. And this really establishes the sound of Italian music for the next century. Is this change in Florence, and then Florentine composers suddenly have the money and the springboard they need to go around the rest of Europe and spread their song. But I thought that was quite interesting that even though they've been doing quite a good job of not having aristocrats, as soon as they did, it did a lot better. Right, we're going to move on to much of the time. Don't want to keep it too long. Okay. We're going to move on to John Dunstable, who was with the Van Eyck. John Dunstable worked for the Duke of Bedford and travelled, as Clare said, to France. And he, interestingly, is quoted as the author on mathematics and astrology volumes. And he's not the only one. There's lots of these other composers who are also poets. All of them have been poets so far. I haven't mentioned a single person who was a poet as well as a composer. They're also writing countless other things. I think that is very important to bear in mind. And Dunstable specifically, mathematics, astrology and music. When he died on his tomb, it said, this new Nicholas, a new Ptolemy, a younger Atlas supporting the heavens. I don't think it was that good, but he did quite well. He's found in this important manuscript called the Old Hall manuscript of 15th century English choral music. So Dunstable was working for a duke. He's not just writing music, he's also writing these other books. And he could be said to be under the patronage of the church as a whole. He's writing for the church. But this brings up quite an interesting problem with the idea of church patronage, which is that whilst the church encouraged and promoted music whilst it encouraged and promoted music, it was doing so out of obligation, not the free way where an artistic patron would do. He has money to spend and he wants to foster these arts. These church institutions were providing mediums for performances, but those were stipulated in the original endowments and statutes of whichever institution we're talking about. For Eton, for example, it was set up with the understanding that music had to happen every day for the services, and the money would only keep coming in if that kept happening. So to what extent you can really call the church a patron in the 15th, 20th century, England especially, is quite debatable, because even when these developments in church music happened, for which they needed to find extra money and extra singers, for example, polyphony going from solo singing to choral singing, or the use of boys' choirs in every cathedral in the country, all this money is actually being found from lay aristocrats. So the church is acting as the agent of these musicians, but not as its patron. So the composers are relying on the church's esteem to bring money in from these lay aristocrats. And that's the same in the arts as well, to some degree. The church's money isn't paying for these great monuments. It is working to attract the funding from others, and it's using its privileged position as an enormously important name to bring in the money, and it then can spend it on what it wants. So it's the agent rather than patron. So it's important that whilst it was working as the agent, it wasn't choosing these musicians. It wanted musicians to come in from a very young age and spend their entire lives in the system. And I think that leads us on nicely to our last composer, Guillaume Dufay, who wrote that piece we heard as we were looking at the dome of Florence Cathedral. At this point, the focus is going to polyphony more. Everyone wants it, and everyone's getting it as well. The effect of the councils there is also a positive effect, to be said, of the schism. More papal courts mean more music, up to 3 at one point. So you've got 3 times as many commissions and singers, and 3 many times as very large services going on. Choir schools in Italy are being established or strengthened if they already exist, and for the first time you get voice parts appear in job descriptions, which prove that they're going to be singing polyphony, because it says we need a bass over here, we need an alto over there. Interestingly, there's still no job descriptions with composition on. Its composition is still, at this point, aside. Dufay is a singer in the papal chapel. He moves with the court, he moves with the Pope, but the fact that he can compose is still just luck. But what people are doing now is starting to commission from internationally renowned composers. At this point in Italy especially, the signori, or the people ruling these cities, were taking a really active role in the music of their cathedral choirs, at least until they set up their own household chapels with often a better choir than the cathedral. But I think it's worth mentioning that they're realising how important the sound of your city and your court is to its standing. And so that's why they're pouring money into new commissions of pieces from people like Dufay, and the ever-increasing numbers of musicians and singers. He has a long list of events that he wrote pieces for, and we're going to sing a couple on Thursday, including this one, and a piece he wrote for the marriage of what you find out on Thursday. I think the important word here is cosmopolitanism. People are starting to take commission from other countries, other cultures, and they're also getting singers in from other courts, other countries. In this sort of, the Dukes of Ferrara sort of kick this off with the Este family, and the Medici then follow, and the Sforza and the Gonzagas, they all follow this idea. They really want to kidnap the best musicians from the cathedrals because they haven't got the money to support these composers and musicians who suddenly want an extra 10 singers for this and that. Well, the cathedrals can't do it because, as you know, all their money is tied up. They can only afford very specific things. The courts, however, have cash everywhere, and all the people all of the important musicians are flooding to the courts now. That's where it's happening. Not in stationary places, but in moving courts or secular courts. And that piece, I'm not going to talk about it length, I want to, but we have to right now. But I'm just going to say that there's an incredible set of ratios in that piece. There are 4. Yeah, that'd be lovely. There's 4 sections of this piece, and they're meant to correspond with the ratio of Solomon's Temple in the Bible. Solomon's Temple is 60 cubits long, it's 30 cubits wide, it's 20 cubits high, and the nave is 40, and then the crossing and apse is, well, they didn't call them those things obviously, it's 20. So these are what are in the Bible as the ratios of Solomon's Temple, and obviously the allegory of Solomon's Temple to the Christian church is rife in medieval thinking. And also they're the ratios of this cathedral. This cathedral's ratios are copied on that of Solomon's Temple. And also really important in the motet are the numbers 2 and 7 and 4 and 7. For instance, he sets the first 7 words of the chant in the tenor, and he sets them to 14 notes. And there are 7 pillars in Solomon's Temple, and it was consecrated on the 7th day, it took 7 days, and it goes on in the classic biblical fashion. 7 is everywhere, as is 4 and 14, and all of these ratios are mimicked in this motet in an incredible way. And when we listen to it on Thursday, you can hear something. You obviously can't hear the overarching architectonic design, but you can hear that whoever wrote the music sort of knows it's there. there's a quiet surety and almost smugness about the unveiling of Florence Cathedral and the dedication of it, especially in some of the music that was written for it. So it's trying to play on this idea of celestial balance, numerology, incredibly important number symbology, and it's doing this to the unveiling of what we call, as we talked about, sort of a Renaissance, an early Renaissance moment, a turning point, the fact that this is set amongst all of these courts trying to get the best musicians and start the musical renaissance. Yet the piece that does it is possibly the most medieval in design you could possibly come across, in the fact that it is completely unhumanist and relies completely on Pythagoras' music of spheres and perfect harmony. So that's just an interesting note to end on, that actually music doesn't always follow the other arts. It relates to them and it responds to them, but in different ways. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew, for that wonderfully rich and very